Ask 5 people what melodic hardcore is, and you'll get 5 completely different answers. Some will say it's hardcore with harmonies. Others will say it's emo with breakdowns. And some will say, what are you on about? And what are you doing in my house? But whatever you think it is, it feels different. This is melodic hardcore, a subgenre of hardcore that screams its heart out. So where did it come from? What made it so popular? And most importantly, what am I doing in your house? Trying to define melodic hardcore is like a group of people trying to paint the Sistine Chapel, except no one knows what it's supposed to look like and someone's bought crayons. It's not easy to define. The genre is incredibly broad and everyone's got their own interpretation of what it's meant to be, so I'm gonna try my best. Essentially, melodic hardcore is exactly what it sounds like. Hardcore punk, but with melody. Not necessarily in the vocals, but in the guitar and in the emotion, and maybe also in the vocals too. Before I even knew what two-stepping was, I found an album called The Kids We Used to Be by Your Demise. I didn't know what melodic hardcore was, I hardly even knew what hardcore was. But what I did know is that this album hit me in a way nothing else had. It was aggressive but emotional, heavy but also catchy. Sure, I'd been listening to heavy music all throughout my teenage years, but this just felt different. It wasn't until later, when I actually started going to shows, that it all clicked. That record didn't just introduce me to a band, it introduced me to a whole genre and a whole world I didn't even know I'd been looking for. Looking back, The Kids We Used to Be probably isn't what most people would call a pure melodic hardcore album, but that's the thing. Melodic hardcore doesn't have a set formula. It's not about clean vocals or emotional lyrics. It's a feeling. And when I started to dig deeper, I realized that this sound, the one I stumbled upon by accident, had been evolving for decades. To really understand what makes melodic hardcore what it is, we have to go back to where it all started. Before the sing-alongs, before the breakdowns, back to the early days of hardcore itself. Hardcore punk back in the early 80s wasn't exactly known for its emotional depth. It was raw and fast, and sung by people who were pissed off. Bands like Black Flag, Minor Threat, and Bad Brains were creating 2-minute bursts of pure chaotic frustration. But even then, bands started experimenting. 7 Seconds, Dag Nasty, Descendants, Bad Religion, they didn't soften the sound, but they started to change it slightly. The aggression was still there, but so were slivers of melody. Dag Nasty, who were made up of ex-members of Minor Threat, released Can I Say in 1986, and now Hardcore Had Feelings. Can I Say is often cited as one of the first real melodic hardcore albums. It still had shouty vocals, but now the guitar work was cleaner. And then 2 years later, Bad Religion released Suffer. It was still fast, like much of the skate punk that came before it, but now it had harmonies and catchy hooks, laying down the foundation for the skate punk side of melodic hardcore, with Fat Mike of NOFX going on to say that Suffer was the record that changed everything. At the same time, over in Washington DC, bands like Rites of Spring and Embrace were taking the chaotic sound of hardcore punk, but making it more emotional. That sound would go on to be called emo, but its roots were the same: melodic, introspective, and undeniably hardcore. This wasn't a new subgenre yet, just a couple of bands testing the limits of what hardcore could be, but the idea was there. Hardcore didn't have to be angry, it could be emotional too. By the 1990s, hardcore had started to split. On one side, you had bands getting heavier, moving towards beatdown and metallic hardcore, but on the other, bands were starting to rely on emotion rather than aggression. They were still played with the intensity of hardcore, but now bands were adding melody and vulnerability. This wasn't a clean break, by the way. It's not like a group of guys were sitting in a pub having a few Guinnesses and decided to invent melodic hardcore. Chances are those guys were straight edge anyway. This was a gradual build, one where feeling crept through the riffs and the lyrics until it hit you in the face like a 17-year-old doing spin kicks. In New Jersey, Lifetime were blending youth crew hardcore with catchy, almost pop-punk hooks. It was still aggressive and fast, but when they released Hello Bastards in 1995, it now came with a lot more melody. It didn't just shove melody into hardcore, it redefined what the genre could sound like. Meanwhile, in the Midwest, bands like Endpoint and Split Lip were carving out their own emotional hardcore style. Endpoint's 1992 album Catharsis was passionate, political, and melodic. Split Lip, who'd later become Chamberlain, were even more introspective. At the same time, on the West Coast, bands like Ignite were bringing in melodic vocals without losing intensity, and Farside were mixing hardcore with alt-rock influences, bouncier riffs, cleaner production, but still emotional. In Boston and New York, the Youth Crew revival had fully kicked off. Bands like In My Eyes, 10 Yard Fight, and later Bane were bringing back the spirit of the 80s. It was fast, positive and energetic, but now with cleaner playing, bigger hooks, and lyrics that weren't afraid to be self-reflective. Then there was skate punk, Bad Religion, NOFX, Pennywise. Although technically not hardcore, it was still fast, emotional, and melodic enough that the influence started to bleed between the two scenes. If you were a hardcore kid with a skateboard, chances are you were listening to both. And if you were a kid in the 2000s playing a Tony Hawk Pro Skater on the PS2, you were definitely listening to both. And yeah, the emo scene was still running parallel the entire time. Texas Is the Reason, Jawbreaker, Falling Forward, and Sense Field. They weren't playing traditional hardcore, but they carried the same emotional weight. Melody didn't mean softness, it meant honesty. And whether it was shouted, sung, or buried under distortion, that resonated with a lot of hardcore kids, whether they liked to admit it or not. By the early 2000s, melodic hardcore wasn't just an idea anymore, it became a sound, a scene, and in a lot of places, it was the sound of hardcore. The influence of 90s hardcore was still there, but now a new generation was picking up the torch. Bands like Have Heart, Verse, and Modern Life is War weren't just playing what they thought melodic hardcore could be, they were defining what it was. Have Heart became the benchmark. Their lyrics were deeply personal about family, mental health, self-worth, but delivered with full force intensity of classic hardcore. In 2008, they released Songs to Scream At the Sun, an album that is not only one of the greatest melodic hardcore albums of all time, but probably one of the best within the entirety of hardcore. Verse leaned more political, mixing fury with reflection. Modern Life is War brought in more poetic, almost literary edge. It felt like hardcore was finally growing up. From the emotions to the crowds, everything was bigger. And there wasn't just one sound. Some bands leaned heavier, like The Hope Conspiracy, Ruiner, and American Nightmare. Others brought in more of a punk energy, like Strike Anywhere and Comeback Kid. Comeback Kid's Wake the Dead in 2005 became one of the genre's biggest crossover records. Hooky enough for punk kids, heavy enough for hardcore kids, and catchy enough to pull in everyone else. The Youth Crew revival from the late 90s was still going strong too. Bands like the aforementioned Bane kept the energy alive but updated it. Faster riffs, tighter songwriting, and lyrics that felt more vulnerable than preachy, to the point that they're still going strong to this day. And depending on where you were, the sound shifted. In Boston, it was passionate and positive. In Australia, bands like Miles Away were blending melody with grit in their own way. And in the UK, this was my scene. Bands like Dead Swans were tearing it up with raw, unfiltered emotion. Their 2009 record Sleepwalkers felt like it was held together by spit, sweat, and heartbreak. They weren't just a standout in the UK, they became one of the most internationally respected bands in the genre, even signing to Bridgeline Records and touring the world. Your Demise in their early days brought that same hardcore urgency, but with massive hooks and a vibe that felt uniquely ours. Their 2009 album Ignorance Never Dies balanced raw aggression with just enough melody to make it anthemic. Also with a few dubstep tracks in between. And Heights, while they'd evolved later, were already adding atmosphere and depth to their sound in a way that felt totally in step with the global shift. These were the bands I grew up with. These were the shows I went to. For me and a lot of UK kids, this was melodic hardcore. This was the boom. Melodic hardcore had arrived, and for a few years, it felt like every kid in a dingy Brighton club was screaming their lungs out to songs that actually meant something. In the 2010s, melodic hardcore has started to blur. What was once a defined sound, aggressive but emotional hardcore punk, was now stretching in every direction. Some bands leaned into heaviness, others drifted into atmosphere, and more than a few left the genre altogether. But before we talk about what it became, we need to talk about what held it all together. In the early 2010s, a new generation of bands were carrying the torch, but they weren't doing it the same way their predecessors had. Counterparts, Stick to Your Guns, and The Ghost Inside led what some fans half-jokingly called the serious core wave. They took the emotion and melody of classic classic melodic hardcore and gave it a heavier, more metallic edge. Counterparts in particular nailed this balance. Furious riffs, breakdowns, and heart-on-sleeve lyrics about loss, depression, and isolation. Albums like The Current Will Carry Us and Tragedy Will Find Us didn't just hit well, they hit hard. Stick to Your Guns leaned more political and anthemic. Diamond in 2012 became a scene staple, angry and furious yet hopeful and inspiring. And The Ghost Inside added even more weight, blending melodic hardcore with metalcore heaviness, and still finding room for introspection and perseverance. This wave didn't just keep melodic hardcore alive, it pushed it to new heights. These bands were playing festivals, charting, and gaining fans outside of traditional hardcore circles, which is why I think these bands are considered to many as metalcore bands, especially to those on Twitter that don't actually know what metalcore is. But whilst one side of the genre was getting heavier, another side was getting softer, more introspective, and much more ambient. Then came Dreambound. If you were aware of the scene during the mid to late 2010s, you knew about Dreambound. It's a YouTube channel that became the platform for the new wave of emotional melodic hardcore bands. Bands like Casey and Hotel Books. Casey made heartbreak feel all-encompassing. Their music was fragile and poetic. Their second album, Where I Go When I'm Sleeping, released to rave reviews from critics and fans alike for Tom's ability to turn his personal struggles with disease, afflictions, and relationships into something that can be relatable. And maybe to an extent holding absence. They followed a similar path, soaring choruses and their black and white aesthetics with songs about love and vulnerability. There was also Hundreth, who started as a melodic hardcore band, but by 2017 they'd completely transformed into a shoegaze act with Rare. And by this point, the lines were gone. Right, so this is where things get muddy, because depending on who you ask, there's a solid argument that these artists are actually post-hardcore. And I just know I'm going to get a bunch of comments saying, actually, these bands are post-hardcore, which is fair. But the thing is, the overlap between melodic and post-hardcore is so massive that if you were to put the two in a Venn diagram, the crossover would be about the same size as your mum. Some bands leaned into emo, some leaned into post-rock, and some leaned fully into shoegaze. But all of them had started in or around melodic hardcore. The genre became less of a sound and more of a feeling, something that could exist in different ways. Even earlier in the decade, a loose collective of bands known as The Wave had already been reshaping what emotional hardcore looked like. Touche, Amore, Defeater, and La Dispute weren't strictly melodic hardcore, but they made it okay to scream about fear, grief, and existential dread. Touche Amore packed heavy feelings into short bursts of chaos. Defeater built entire concept albums around fractured families and post-war trauma, and La Dispute, well, they wrote hardcore songs that sounded like modernist poetry, and they also made for a sick tattoo when you were 18 years old. These bands inspired a whole generation to embrace vulnerability, to scream not out of anger, but because it hurt. By the end of the decade, the genre had scattered. Some of its most influential bands had either evolved or gone quiet, but what these bands created didn't disappear. If anything, it got absorbed into emo, into post-hardcore, into shoegaze. Melodic hardcore didn't die in the 2010s, it bled into everything else. After a decade of fragmentation, melodic hardcore started to piece itself back together. It's not something that came back quickly, it's happening slowly. I feel like beatdown is still the more dominant subgenre currently, but there are still a few bands around that are wearing their heart on their sleeve when it comes to hardcore. A new wave of bands that aren't trying to reinvent the genre, but instead just playing it like it still mattered. I feel like I'm mentioning them in every video at the moment, but one step closer are pretty much the modern torchbearer when it comes to melodic hardcore in the 2020s. They're fast, emotional, and extremely heartfelt. Their 2021 album, This Place You Know, carried the DNA of Have Heart, but from a younger perspective. It sounded like the kind of record you scream alone in your room, but also have a little boogie to. And now with their most recent release, All You Embrace, they're leaning a lot more into the melodic half of melodic hardcore. Fiddlehead, formed by members of Have Heart and Basement, brought a different kind of maturity to the genre. Their records, especially Between the Richness, blended melodic hardcore with an indie rock sound. It's introspective, reflective, but still hits when it needs to. Anxious lean more into the emo pop punk end of things, but their roots are unmistakably in hardcore. And then we have Higher Power, a UK band that took things in a more alternative and crossover direction, pulling just as much from Deftones and alt metal as they do from melodic hardcore. They've become one of the most exciting bands from the UK hardcore scene in years. Their album 27 Miles Underwater expanded the boundaries of what melodic hardcore could sound like without losing its core. And also, Nick Worthington of Dead Swans has started a new band called Still in Love, alongside ex-members of Brutality Will Prevail and Bring Me the Horizon. They've released 2 EPs so far, and they absolutely rip of old school melodic hardcore. There's also bands like Koyo, Military Gun, and Soulblind, all taking that hardcore foundation and injecting it with melody, hooks, and a sense of progression. What makes this resurgence feel different is that it's not about rehashing the past, it's about reclaiming the emotional weight that made melodic hardcore connect in the first place. These bands grew up on albums like Songs to Scream at the Sun and Sleepwalkers, and now they're doing it in their way. Trying to define melodic hardcore might be like trying to paint the Sistine Chapel with a crayon, but one thing's clear: it leaves a mark. It's aggressive, it's emotional, it's chaotic and vulnerable all at once. It doesn't always follow the rules, and that's kind of the point. Whether it's shouted over punk riffs or screamed through walls of shoegaze, melodic hardcore is about connection. To the music, to the words, and to the people screaming them right back at you. It's not just about what it sounds like, it's about what it feels like. And that feeling is something you don't forget. I've been James. Like and subscribe if you've enjoyed. Thanks for watching.